It was the year of the Lord, 1099. The First Crusade had come to its triumphant close, and the Holy Land had been reclaimed by the Knights of Christendom. Yet, beneath the hallowed stones of Jerusalem, ancient forces stirred, forces that defied all human comprehension. Yet, in those early months, there were only whispers of betrayal in the ranks of the Templars, and no one knew how disastrous this act of heresy would be, and how much bloodshed it would bring. Far from the heart of those rumors, on the serene shores of Cyprus, a small village stirred with other news. An enigmatic man, cloaked in tattered robes, arrived at the town accompanied by a devout group of followers who called him the Prophet. They spoke in reverent tones of the Prophet's divine visions and his proclamation. The balance between heaven and hell had been shattered, and he would march to Jerusalem to restore it in the name of Christ. Such an event was something of a novelty, and one that piqued the interest of most locals, regardless of the fervor of their faith. Among the curious onlookers stood a young carpenter's apprentice, a boy of no more than 17 years. His name was Elias. Ambitious and restless, Elias had long yearned to see the world beyond the confines of his island. When he saw the Prophet, something stirred deep within him, a yearning that no hammer or chisel could satisfy. Elias watched as the Prophet spoke, his voice calm yet commanding, reverberating through the crowd like the toll of a great cathedral bell. "The Holy Land burns," the Prophet declared, his gaze piercing through the throng. "The enemy is no longer flesh and blood. Demons walk among us, and the faithful are called to rise. Our Lord calls us to Jerusalem, to restore the balance and strike down the forces of hell." The crowd murmured in awe and disbelief. Everyone was aware of the recent victory and the recapture of Jerusalem from the hands of the Muslims. Many dismissed the man as a zealot, but Elias felt an inexplicable pull, a sense of destiny that rooted him to the ground. That night, as the village returned to its routines, Elias argued with his father. "You're a boy," his father bellowed, his fists clenched with anger and fear. "You've no place among madmen and their impossible quests." "But father," Elias pleaded, "this is my chance to serve something greater, to see the world beyond this place, and to get yourself killed," his father interrupted, his voice breaking. However, the decision had already been made, and nothing would be able to dissuade him from the chosen path. At dawn, as the Prophet and his followers prepared to set sail, Elias stood at the shore, his few belongings packed in a small satchel. His father's protests still echoed in his mind, but his heart was firm and ready. He needs to go. The journey across the sea was grueling, yet enlightening. The Prophet spent the days preaching of the war between heaven and hell, painting vivid images of angelic armies and demonic hordes. At first, Elias struggled to believe, but as the days turned into weeks, the Prophet's words began to feel less like stories and more like truth. By the time their ship docked at Haifa, Elias was no longer the curious young man he once was. His heart was afire with purpose, and he marched ashore ready to fight for Christ. Along the way to Jerusalem, their group Pilgrims joined their cause, inspired by the Prophet's vision. In a matter of days, a dozen followers became 100, and the march became a pilgrimage. But Jerusalem was no longer the holy city Elias had imagined. The gates of Jerusalem loomed ahead, battered and scorched by countless assaults. What should have been a triumphant moment for Elias and the other pilgrims was instead somber and chaotic. The city was barely recognizable as the holy sanctuary they had imagined. Smoke coiled into the sky, mingling with the acrid stench of blood and sulfur. Soldiers and civilians moved frantically through the gates, their faces pale with exhaustion and terror. As Elias and the Prophet's followers approached, they were intercepted by a group of local militia. These men were not the proud crusaders Elias had envisioned. Their armor was mismatched, their weapons worn, and their eyes haunted. They barely spared the Prophet a glance. "Another group," one of the soldiers muttered, his voice tinged with annoyance. "Good. You're needed. Quickly now. This isn't a pilgrimage anymore. But we have come to fight for the Lord," the Prophet declared, raising his staff. "I am his servant, sent to—" "I don't care who sent you," the soldier snapped, cutting him off. "We need every hand we can get. If you can swing a blade or carry a pike, you're going to the front. If not, stay out of the way." Elias felt a pang of disillusionment. He had imagined their arrival would inspire the city, that the prophet's words would rally the defenders. But here, among the chaos and fear, there was no room for miracles. The men and women of Jerusalem were consumed by one goal: survival. Another soldier, a younger man with a hastily tied bandage around his arm, approached the group. He scanned the pilgrims, his expression grim. "You," he pointed at Elias and a few others. "Over there, report to Captain Lamar. They need reinforcements on the eastern wall." Elias hesitated, looking to the prophet for guidance, but the older man simply nodded. "Go," the prophet said. "Do as they command. God's will is not always clear, but you must trust in it." As the group dispersed, Elias was handed a spear and shoved toward the eastern gate. The instructions were curt, almost indifferent. "Hold the line. Don't let them through. That's all you need to know." The young carpenter's apprentice found himself among a ragtag band of defenders. Farmers, shopkeepers, and weathered soldiers who bore the marks of countless battles. No one asked who he was or where he had come from. The prophet's presence had already been forgotten in the chaos. To them, Elias was just another body to throw into the fray. All around him, the city was a whirlwind of activity. Messengers darted between the makeshift command posts, shouting orders that were barely understood. Supplies were dragged to the front lines, often arriving too late to be of any real use. Elias caught snippets of conversation as he moved, frustrated arguments about strategy, prayers muttered under breath, and cries of pain from the wounded. It became painfully clear that no one truly knew how to fight this enemy. Demons were not like human adversaries. They could not be reasoned with, and their unholy strength and speed made traditional tactics almost useless. The defenders fought because there was no alternative. It was to fight or be devoured. As Elias reached the eastern wall, he stole a glance at the horizon. The air shimmered with heat and ash, and in the distance, he could see the twisted forms of the enemy gathering. His grip on the spear tightened. For all the prophet's words, for all his newfound purpose, Elias had never felt more unprepared. A grizzled soldier beside him clapped him on the shoulder. "First time?" the man asked, his tone oddly calm. Elias nodded, his mouth dry. "Don't think," the soldier said. "Just fight. You'll live longer that way." The night descended upon the camp like a shroud, but there was no peace in the darkness. The sky above Jerusalem seemed alive with the flicker of unnatural flames, casting jagged shadows over the broken walls and crumbled sanctuaries. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the city itself resisted the weight of its unholy invaders. Elias stood among the growing ranks of pilgrims. The 100 who had followed the prophet from Haifa now stood shoulder to shoulder with hardened crusaders and desperate villagers armed with crude weapons. Their numbers paled in comparison to the seething horde they faced beyond the walls. Then came the sound, a guttural, otherworldly howl that shook Elias to his core. From the blackness beyond the ruins, the forces of hell emerged. The sight was a waking nightmare. Demons of all shapes and sizes stormed forth, hulking beasts with molten skin, shadowy wraiths that moved like liquid smoke, and serpentine horrors with eyes like burning coals. The ground quaked under their weight, their roars drowning out the prayers and cries of the defenders. Elias's grip on his spear faltered. Around him, men and women trembled, their courage ebbing like water through a sieve. Yet he saw that the prophet stood firm. His staff was raised high, and his voice rang out over the chaos. "Stand strong. The Lord watches over his faithful. In his name, we shall prevail." The prophet's words ignited a brief spark of hope, and the defenders charged, despite Lamar's cries of dissent. Elias found himself swept forward, his legs moving before his mind could comprehend. The clash was instantaneous and brutal. Spears shattered against demonic hides, swords glanced off unholy armor, and the battlefield became a cacophony of screams and roars. Elias thrust his weapon at a demon that loomed over him. The tip of the spear struck flesh, but the beast barely flinched. Its clawed hand lashed out, sending the boy sprawling into the mud. Around him, his fellow pilgrims fell, torn apart by claws and fangs. The prophet himself fought valiantly, his staff glowing with an unearthly light as he chanted prayers that seemed to momentarily repel the creatures. But even he could not hold back the tide. Elias felt his will shatter. He fell to his knees, his spear slipping from his hands. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered a prayer, his voice trembling. "Lord, forgive me, I cannot—" A shadow fell over him. The searing heat of Tartarus steel pierced his chest, and pain unlike anything he had known coursed through his body. He collapsed into the mud, his blood pooling around him. The world blurred, the cacophony fading into a distant hum. Above him, the sky was a swirling chaos of smoke and fire. Elias closed his eyes, his breath shallow, his body numb. But then, as the darkness threatened to consume him, a voice echoed in his mind, deep, resonant, and filled with an unshakable authority. "Rise, my child. Your fight is not yet over."